In a storage cabinet in Colorado, wrapped in plaster and cotton, there is a skull small enough to fit inside a coffee mug. Pale, fragile, and, until fairly recently, sitting unopened inside an ordinary-looking rock that nobody thought to crack. It does not belong to a dinosaur. It was pulled from a pale band of rock that only began forming after every dinosaur except the birds had already vanished from the planet. And for a long time, nobody in that part of Colorado thought there was anything worth digging there at all, because the layer above the extinction line was assumed to be empty, almost lifeless, a gap. What that skull, and the hundreds of others found beside it, eventually proved is stranger and slower than the story most of us grew up with. We are taught that an asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs, and that mammals simply inherited what was left, as if extinction were a door that opened directly onto something new. The rock in that Colorado hillside tells a different story. It says the door opened first onto darkness, onto hunger, onto a planet that had to relearn piece by piece how to grow a forest, rebuild a food chain, and produce an animal larger than a house cat. That single skull is not a snapshot of the beginning of our world. It is one frame from the middle of the hardest reconstruction project life has ever attempted. And by the time this story is finished, you will understand why it took nearly 1 million years, and why that number changes what mammals, and eventually we, actually owe to chance. If the kind of story that hides inside a single piece of ordinary-looking rock is the sort of thing that keeps you watching, this is a good moment to subscribe, so the next buried investigation finds you when it's ready to be told. To understand what that skull meant, we have to go back to the world it was never supposed to belong to. 66 million years ago, the planet did not belong to anything the size of a human hand. It belonged to animals the size of buses, to river deltas thick with ferns and conifers, to food webs built, tier by tier, around large-bodied specialists that had already ruled every continent for more than 100 million years. Coastal forests ran unbroken for thousands of kilometers, warm and humid, threaded with slow rivers that fed swamps where turtles and crocodilians had already perfected a body plan they would barely need to change for the next 66 million years. Overhead, the skies belonged to flying reptiles and to early birds sharing the same air as their larger grounded relatives. Mammals existed in that world, but they were background characters, mostly small, mostly nocturnal. Built for slipping through gaps, the giants never had a reason to notice, foraging in the dark for insects and seeds, while a few meters away, animals many times their size shaped the entire structure of the forest around them. Then, in the space of a few seconds, an object roughly 10 to 12 kilometers across, moving faster than sound, struck the shallow sea covering what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The scar it left is still there, buried under limestone and jungle, a crater close to 200 kilometers across, the signature of an impact carrying energy on the order of 10 to the 23rd joules. Numbers that size stop meaning much on their own, so picture it differently. This was not a local disaster. It was an event with enough force to reach into the atmosphere and the oceans of an entire planet all at once. The first minutes after impact are almost too violent to picture in ordinary terms. Rock vaporized where the asteroid struck, punching through the crust and throwing molten debris on a ballistic arc that came down as far away as North America, igniting wildfires wherever it landed. The shock, traveling outward through the crust, triggered earthquakes far stronger than anything in recorded human history, and the collapse of the shallow sea above the impact site sent tsunamis racing across the Gulf of Mexico and beyond, tearing sediment from coastlines thousands of kilometers away. All of that happened before most of the planet even registered that something had gone wrong. Within 4 to 5 hours, according to reconstructions built from seismic data, displaced rock, and climate models, the debris thrown up by that impact had spread around the entire globe. A rock deep inside the crater's peak ring, drilled by an international science expedition and now held in laboratories for study, preserves roughly 130 meters of shattered, melted material laid down within the very first day of what scientists now call the Cenozoic. In other words, the opening page of the world after the dinosaurs already exists. It is buried inside the crater that created it, but the asteroid itself was only the trigger. What followed was slower and in some ways more dangerous because it didn't need heat or a shockwave to do its damage. It needed darkness. The rock that Chicxulub struck was rich in sulfur and carbon. Vaporized and thrown skyward, it became a haze of dust, soot, and sulfate particles wrapping the entire Earth. A model published in 2023, built from measurements of extremely fine silicate dust between roughly 0.8 and 8 micrometers across, estimated that particles that small could linger in the upper atmosphere for as long as 15 years, cool the planet's average temperature by as much as 15 degrees Celsius, and interrupt nearly all photosynthesis for close to 2 years. Not slow it down, interrupt it, because almost every food chain on land and in the ocean begins with something green converting sunlight into energy. This is the detail that turns an asteroid strike into a famine spanning continents. The exact severity and duration of that impact winter are still debated among scientists. Estimates range from months to well over a decade, depending on how much dust, soot, and sulfate each model assumes. But the underlying mechanism is not in question. Light disappeared, warmth disappeared, and with them went the base of nearly every food web on Earth. Roughly 3 out of every 4 species on the planet did not survive what came next. Every dinosaur that could not fly was among them. And this is where the popular version of the story usually ends, with the giants gone and the mammals waiting in the wings. But that framing skips the part that actually decided who got to inherit the planet, because losing 3/4 of Earth's species does not simply clear space for whoever is left. It breaks the machinery those species depended on. Predators lost prey, herbivores lost plants. Even the earliest survivors were not stepping into an empty stage. They were stepping into wreckage. The crisis did not stop at the coastline either. In the oceans, the same collapse in photosynthesis that starved life on land struck the plankton that anchored marine food webs. And evidence from ocean sediments points to rapid acidification in the surface waters of the earliest Paleogene. Entire groups of shelled plankton that had thrived for tens of millions of years thinned out almost to nothing, and the animals that depended on them, directly or through several links in the chain, went down with them. It is easy to picture an asteroid strike as something that happens to a landscape. This one reorganized an entire planet's chemistry, above and below the waterline, at the same time. One detail is worth pausing on, because it complicates the dinosaurs versus mammals version of this story. Not every dinosaur died. Birds are dinosaurs, descended from small feathered theropods that had already been flying for tens of millions of years before the impact, and they are the one dinosaur lineage that made it through. Whatever let a bird survive that darkness? Small body size, a flexible diet, the ability to nest or shelter through the worst of it. turns out to be close to the same list of traits that let the earliest surviving mammals make it through as well. Because that is the part almost nobody expects. The animals that made it were not the strongest, or the smartest, or the ones best adapted to the world as it had existed the week before. They were the ones least dependent on that world staying the same. Small mammals with generalist diets, capable of switching between seeds, insects, and carrion, depending on whatever the ruined landscape still offered. Turtles, crocodilians, and amphibians tied to water, which buffered some of the worst temperature swings on land and let them wait out the worst months in rivers, lakes, and burrows. Creatures that could shelter underground, eat almost anything, and simply endure long enough for conditions to change. None of this was a strategy any individual animal chose. It was generation after generation, which combination of traits happened to keep enough individuals alive to reproduce. In a landscape stripped of its large herbivores and its apex predators, being unremarkable was, for the first time in tens of millions of years, an advantage. It's worth pausing here on what the science actually agrees on and what it doesn't. That Chicxulub struck roughly 66 million years ago and drove the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs is about as settled as questions in paleontology get. So is the basic mechanism: dust, soot, and sulfate blocking sunlight, cooling the planet, and collapsing plant productivity worldwide. What remains genuinely debated is the fine detail: how many months or years the worst of the darkness lasted, how much of the planet actually burned versus how much simply went cold and quiet, and how large a role a separate, ongoing episode of volcanic activity in what is now India, known as the Deccan Traps, played in destabilizing the climate in the millennia leading up to the impact. Most of the evidence still points to Chicxulub as the trigger that turned a gradually stressed biosphere into a sudden, planet-wide collapse. But good science means naming the parts that are still argued over, not smoothing them into false certainty. The same caution applies to how completely the planet burned. Extensive fires clearly followed the impact in many regions, but the image of the entire globe on fire at once outpaces what the evidence actually supports. And it is worth resisting that exaggeration, even where it would make for a more dramatic scene. Waiting, though, is not the same as recovering, and the recovery is where this story becomes something closer to a mystery than a catastrophe film. Because the fossil record shows that life did not come back all at once. It came back in stages, almost like a staircase, and each step took the planet a strange, specific amount of time to climb. The first step was the simplest kind of life to reboot. Not animals, but plants, and not even complex plants. Immediately above the extinction layer in site after site around the world, geologists find what paleobotanists call a fern spike, an explosion of fern spores in the rock, marking a landscape where almost nothing else could grow yet. Ferns are opportunists. They do not need pollinators, they tolerate poor soil, and they can colonize devastated ground faster than almost anything else with roots. For a stretch of time that we can only describe in general terms, the planet's dominant plant was, essentially, weeds, low, fast-growing, and utterly unremarkable blanketing ground that only a short while before had supported some of the most complex forests the planet had ever produced. This is the moment the story's most important detail enters, and it comes from an unusually rich fossil sequence in the Denver Basin of Colorado, at a site called Corral Bluffs. The same rock formation that eventually surrendered that fist-sized skull over more than a decade of fieldwork Researchers there cataloged more than 6,000 fossil plants alongside dozens of mammal skulls, all locked into a single continuous sequence covering roughly the first million years after the impact. Because the layers can be dated with real precision, Coral Bluffs does something almost no other site on Earth can do. It lets scientists watch the recovery happen one measurable step at a time. The skulls themselves were almost missed. Most of them were not lying exposed on the surface, but sealed inside round, iron-stained concretions scattered across the Colorado Badlands, rocks that generations of fossil hunters had walked past, assuming they were empty. It was only when researchers began deliberately cracking open dozens, then hundreds, of those nondescript stones and later scanning the most promising ones, that skull after skull began to emerge, each one associated with a precise position in the rock layers and therefore a precise slice of time. That patience is the reason this sequence exists at all. Without it, the staircase we are about to walk through would still be sitting, unopened, under the Colorado sun. Here is what those steps look like. In the immediate aftermath, the largest surviving mammals in that record weighed somewhere around half a kilogram, smaller than a modern rat. By roughly 100,000 years after the impact, that ceiling had climbed to around 6 kilograms, roughly the size of a small dog, and the plant record around them had shifted from ferns to the first palm forests. By approximately 300,000 years, the largest mammals in the sequence reached something closer to 25 to 30 kilograms. And alongside them, the plant community had diversified further, with the walnut family, Juglandaceae, becoming part of the forest. The animals attached to these numbers are not abstractions. Around the 300,000-year mark, an omnivorous mammal called Loxolophus appears in the Coral Bluffs sequence, feeding on whatever the recovering forest offered. Not far above it in the rock, a plant-eating mammal named Carsiopticus reaches that 25 to 30 kilogram range, one of the clearest markers of the second major jump in size. By around 700,000 years, mammals near 50 kilograms, animals close to Eoconodon and Ectoconus in the fossil record, comparable in mass to a large dog, though not built or behaving like one, appear alongside the earliest known legume seed pod found at the site in the very same layers. In less than 1 million years, a blink by the standards of deep time, the maximum body size of land mammals in that basin increased by something close to 100-fold. If a number like that reorganizes how you picture the aftermath of the dinosaurs' extinction, this is a fair place to leave a like. It helps a project like this one reach more people who are curious about the same buried evidence. That timeline raises the obvious question this whole investigation has been circling. Why those particular jumps at those particular moments? Why did mammal bodies grow in steps instead of a smooth, steady climb? The Coral Bluffs team's leading hypothesis connects the size increases directly to what was arriving in the forest canopy above those animals. Walnut family trees and legumes are calorie-dense in a way ferns and early recovery vegetation are not, richer in fat and protein, capable of supporting a bigger body and a more specialized digestive system. The timing lines up. Bigger, richer food sources appear in the fossil layers close to, or just before, each jump in mammal body size. But researchers are careful, and the record demands the same caution from us. Correlation in a single fossil sequence is not proof of a single cause. Climate was also warming through this period. Predators that might once have kept mammal populations small and cautious were themselves still re-establishing. Competition between mammal lineages was being renegotiated from scratch. The likeliest explanation, and the one most paleontologists find convincing, is not one trigger but a cascade. New food arriving alongside a landscape with fewer competitors and predators to punish getting larger, at a moment when evolution had unusually wide latitude to experiment with body size. Nutrition may well have been the accelerant. It does not appear to have been acting alone. Zoom out far enough, and the entire sequence reads less like a single event and more like a chain, each link only making sense because of the one before it. An impact striking rock rich in sulfur and carbon, a global cloud of dust and soot, a collapse in sunlight and photosynthesis, the loss of the large specialists that depended on a stable food supply, the survival of small, flexible generalists, a staggered return of plants from simple pioneers to calorie-rich forest, and finally, a jump in body size and diversity among the mammals positioned to take advantage of it. Remove any single link, and the chain most likely produces a different world. It's worth being honest, too, about the limits of what one basin in Colorado can tell us. Corral Bluffs offers an exceptional, high-resolution record, but it is one place on one continent. Other regions almost certainly recovered on their own separate timelines, shaped by their own local climates, plant communities, and surviving animal populations. What Corral Bluffs proves is not that every forest on Earth followed this exact staircase. It proves that recovery from a mass extinction is not instantaneous anywhere, and that it can be measured in at least one place with startling precision. There is also a temptation, standing this close to the mammal side of the story, to tell it as an inevitable coronation, as though the extinction cleared the path so that something like us could eventually exist. The fossil record does not support that reading, and it is worth saying plainly. Nothing about that impact aimed at producing large mammals, and nothing about large mammals aimed at producing humans. What the evidence shows is narrower and, in its own way, more remarkable. Selection did not have a destination. It simply rewarded, generation after generation, whichever combination of size, diet, and behavior happened to survive contact with a changed world. The mammals that grew large in the aftermath of Chicxulub were not chosen. They were the ones still standing when new opportunities appeared, and able to make use of them before anything else did. By around 1 million years after the impact, the world documented at Corral Bluffs looked nothing like the one the asteroid had destroyed, and nothing yet like the one that exists today. Palm groves had given way to denser, more layered forest. Walnut family trees and legumes stood alongside plants with no modern descendants at all. Mammals near 50 kilograms moved through undergrowth where, less than 1 million years earlier, nothing had weighed more than a house cat. It was, in every sense, a new experiment, built from survivors, shaped by whatever plants managed to return first, still testing which combinations of size and diet would hold. The specialists were gone. In their place was a slower, stranger process. Small things trying on new roles, one calorie-rich forest at a time, with no guarantee that any particular lineage would keep growing, diversifying, or surviving what came next. Which brings us back to that skull in the Colorado cabinet. No longer just a fragment of bone, but a single measured point on a staircase that took the biosphere the better part of 1 million years to climb. It marks neither the disaster nor the recovery, but the narrow, uncertain space between them, where almost nothing about the outcome was decided yet. Extend that staircase a little further, past the edges of what corral bluffs alone can show us, and you eventually reach forests capable of supporting the earliest primates, then apes, then, tens of millions of years further still, us, not as the destination the story was building toward, but as one more branch that happened to hold on. It helps, at the end of a story like this, to remember what did not disappear. Birds are still dinosaurs, filling the sky over the same kinds of coastal forests their ancestors once shared with animals the size of buildings. Turtles and crocodilians still carry, almost unchanged, the same body plan that got them through a darkness lasting years. The old world was not erased so much as filtered, narrowed down to whichever lineages could bend without breaking, and then handed slowly and without ceremony the raw material to build something else. None of it was written into the asteroid on the day it fell. Shift the impact angle by a few degrees, delay it by a few 100,000 years, or drop it into deep ocean instead of a shallow, sulfur-rich sea. And by nearly every reconstruction scientists have run, the outcome for the dinosaurs, and for every mammal waiting in the undergrowth beneath them, would very likely have been different. We are not the product of a plan the universe was carrying out. We are the outcome of one specific, largely accidental sequence of catastrophe and recovery, recorded in fossils that happened to survive, in a hillside that happened to be excavated, and in a small stone skull that happened to be found before it eroded back into the rock that had kept it hidden for 66 million years.